someone behind me. So at that stage, I was squatting and I turned around, and in my eyesight was a man's groin in black pants. So I was startled and I got up and I realized it was Russell. And then he said, "Well, I'm going to you."
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. By now you've probably heard about Russell Brand cornering a receptionist in the bathroom of the BBC's Los Angeles office and showing her his genitals. This clearly wasn't a consensual encounter. You've heard a part of that being voiced by a voice actor, obviously someone who still intends to be anonymous. But the important thing is, on that day, there's actually a radio clip that was broadcast of Russell and his colleague talking about the encounter in pretty graphic details on that day, on air, 25 minutes after it happened. According to the article in the BBC, she then went to the bathroom to get some sinus medication, walking past the radio studio, meaning the BBC radio studio. And at the time, Russell Brand was an employee of BBC Radio. She then describes squatting to look through the medicine cabinet, and then she says she felt someone behind her. She turned around, as you heard in the audio, to face a man's crotch. She said, "I was startled and got up and realized it was the man that I'd let in, Russell." Now, although she's a receptionist, and I think it would be easy to assume she was the BBC's receptionist, she was actually just a receptionist for a media company that worked in the same building. In any event, in the conversation that followed, according to the BBC article, she recalls him saying, "Oh, I think you're a bit of all right. I think you're a bit of all right." She says that he told her that he was going to call her Betty, and then when she said that that wasn't her name, he replied, "Well, I'm going to," and you just heard that in the audio. And she said, "No, you're not," and he apparently said it again. She says the door to the bathroom was closed and she felt trapped. I don't know if it was locked, but there was apparently banging on the door. So who knows what exactly was going on there. So what we know here is we know when this happened, 16 June 2008. We know where it happened, the BBC's Los Angeles office. We also know how it happened. And I think Brand's mistake was firstly flirting with, I'm assuming it's an American. She talks about having an accent, so maybe she's not. And probably wasn't employed by the BBC as well. I think one could say that if she was employed by the BBC, would this have just disappeared? Who knows? And secondly, I think in terms of how this happened, what is so crucial here is that there was bragging and joking about it 25 minutes later on a radio show. Now, on the one hand, you can laugh about it, and this person who is the victim here did that. She also laughed about it, and then was a little dumbfounded in retrospect.
What just happened? That shouldn't have happened like that. But who would believe me? I was stunned at the time. I didn't know what to do. I then went to text the person that was in the studio with them to say, "Oh my God, the strangest thing happened." I went to the restroom and Russell Brand showed me, to which they replied, "Yes, I know, he's talking about it on air."
So she does report it, and there's sort of a shrugging, yeah, I know. But it goes further than that. We've been talking about innocent until proven guilty and proof and why now. And yeah, you have the answers to all of those. You have Brand condemning himself in his own words on a radio show, the man whom he spoke to, who's technically a witness, who you hear on air saying it's been 25 minutes since he showed his willy to a lady, now saying, this is now 2023, saying through his lawyer, in a statement sent to the BBC via his legal team, Morgan said, "I was not aware until now of the nature of this encounter." Again, I feel that the language here is very pretentious, very kind of legalese. Some people didn't like me saying something about the word refute. It's just not a word I use casually. And I think if you do use that word, it just shows you pretentious, that's all. Unless you're a lawyer. But even then, I think it's quite a pretentious word. It's a word that needs to be used in certain contexts. But somebody saying, I was not aware until now of the nature of this encounter, that's not a kind of a natural response. It's certainly not the same language that you hear of this person, during at the time. And I'll put a link in the description so you can listen to the whole thing yourself. If I put the original audio on here, I'll get demonetized, which gives you an idea of how risque it is, of how unacceptable it is. Now, I'm not really sure what that even means in plain English, because it's not plain English. Saying, I was not aware until now of the nature of this encounter. What does that actually mean? Does it mean I forgot that this happened, but now I remember? Now that you've reminded me, I remember? Does it mean, I wouldn't have known about this even though I'm aware of, one would imagine, I'm aware of what's being said about Russell Brand, but now that you've provided me with proof or evidence, or this incident, you've repeated it. Now I remember it, or now I know what you're talking about, or I can't remember that this happened, even though there's alleged audio proof. I just don't know what he's really saying in those words. Or does it mean he's only been made aware of this now, which is another way of stating the obvious? I am now aware what you are aware of. Okay, so in other words, okay, so what is your position on this in plain English? And what did happen in plain English? So can you see it's becoming very legal and sort of anal in the way that they are now responding to it. And I mean, so you go from being very flippant and very casual, and now suddenly, now we've got to be very careful with every word that we say. And I think that in itself, that caution is a sign of two sides to what is going on here. I mean, you do see the hypocrisy, don't you? Brand supporters have been demanding proof. I've been seeing it in my comments repeatedly. Where's the proof? Innocent until proven guilty. But these are the same people who believe conspiracies about Bill Gates and Fauci and just basically conspiracies without needing any proof. Just sort of say the same general thing with a little bit of background, and then that's all you need. You don't need to prove it. You just need to believe it. I think what we see here in Radio Willygate is a smaller version of the bigger picture. We also see detailed explanations answering the simplistic question, why now? Yeah, you've actually got someone saying that she did say something actually immediately. And how did people respond? Oh, well, he's saying it on the radio anyway. And if he's saying it on the radio anyway, I mean, how did the people who listen to this in Los Angeles respond? By not responding, I guess. And doesn't this person actually feel humiliated in the sense that everybody in the country knows, do I really want to bring additional attention to it? And what are my family going to say? And so if you ask, why did it take this long to find out about Radio Willygate? Well, the answer is actually, she did communicate there and then what had happened. But it was sort of drowned out by this larger personality controlling the narrative. According to the article, Olivia, and that's not her real name, she never made an official complaint, but she said that she hoped that someone from the BBC would contact her after hearing the recording. That never happened. That's also quite interesting that the BBC must have listened to their own content. And what did they make of it? She said, I thought to myself, oh, that's a bit strange that nobody's come to say sorry to me for his behavior. So I thought perhaps that particular audio, because it was so graphic, had been cut, which is probably why I never pursued it. And so just to be clear, this was a pre-recording. And so I think she thought that it would be edited out. And I'm not sure, did she not check that? Was it not discussed when it did come out? I don't know when it would have come out, but it just seems like that's something you would want to ask a few more questions about. Anyway, the truth is even stranger than fiction. Not only was the audio not cut, in other words, it went into, I think, pre-production, and there was an editor, I guess, who could have elected to cut it. That's why I say truth is even stranger than fiction. Whoever was, I guess, supposed to edit it didn't edit it. It was aired as is, and still nothing happened. You want a conspiracy, try a conspiracy of silence. But the question remains why she didn't come forward, like in an official capacity, in a persistent way. Didn't she tell anyone? Well, as I say, actually she did, but I won't say no one believed her, but that is what she sort of seemed to fear. I don't think it's just this thing of no one believing her. I also think it's, well, what are they going to do? What can they do, given the power of the celebrity, given his popularity? According to the article, she says she thought people wouldn't take her seriously. She says, I'm blonde, I'm accented. Not quite sure what that's got to do with anything, but maybe she could explain it. She says she was also worried about the potential impact on her and her family if she had raised it officially. Had I known audio existed, I probably would have done something, as the incident would have been corroborated, she says. Now, this is always the difficulty with sexual offences. There are always two sides to a story, and proof tends to be what one says contradicted by the other. Well, what is really interesting and special about this story is you've actually got audio on that day, 25 minutes later, and then a second person talking about it. So think about it, 11 years after the incident, which is 4 years ago from now, in 2019, the BBC did finally get wind of what happened. Not now, 4 years ago. And then the question is, what did they do 4 years ago when they did find out? According to the article, which is published by the BBC, BBC management was informed about the incident by a BBC staff member who had spoken to Olivia. So obviously, Olivia was spoken to, and she spoke to someone at the BBC, and BBC management did know about it. So if you say, why now in 2023? Well, I think that you could say the same thing in 2019. Why now? No, it wasn't why now. Here's the answer. She says that nobody from BBC management approached her directly about the incident and no formal action was taken. Well, why now becomes, the flip side to why now is if something happens and then there's no accountability or no response or no responsibility, and then something happens again and there's no response, and again and again and again, well, then you can't say why now. In effect, why now is inevitable. In other words, if something happens and there's no response, happens again, no response, something unacceptable happening again and again and again, it's not why now. It's inevitable that eventually there is going to be a response. So I think it's a little hypocritical sketching it in those terms of why now. Why not now? When? If not now, when?
Criticizing those who think they're above the law is a little hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
I don't think proof such as what we've got here is going to be enough for Russell Brand's fans. I don't think any amount of proof is going to be enough, because it's not really about proof. It's about he says what we agree with, and that's all we care about. Probably if you had a trial, maybe he would be found innocent. But if he was found guilty of something, probably they would say, this is part of the conspiracy, this is also rigged. At what point do you eventually accept evidence? At what point do you eventually accept perhaps that you're not correct in what you think? Does that ever happen? So I think what we are going to see following this is another shifting of the goalposts, perhaps less of an emphasis on proof. I've actually just gone on to another YouTuber's platform where he says, you know what, there's not a single instance where something's not consensual, where something happens in an alley. Well, this is an instance of that, isn't it? So what I think we're going to see is less of an emphasis on proof and more of a focus that the mainstream media are out to get Brand in order to silence him. It's a strange way of thinking when Brand is a product of the mainstream media, when he was enabled by it, and this is an example of that, when he was protected by it, and this is an example of that. And it was their silence, and this is an example of that, exhibited here, even in the context of audio admissions broadcast on radio, that protected him for so long. And you've heard that in 2019, when the allegations sort of erupted, what happened? And the answer is nothing happened. And so if nothing happened then, do you say in 2023, why now? And then what happens? You just do nothing now, and then you wait until 2030, and then you say in 2030, why now? And yes, the victims didn't want to come forward for precisely this reason, because those enablers weren't listening, wouldn't listen, wouldn't do anything, and haven't until now. Now you might say, why didn't Olivia just announce what had happened to her? Just announce it. Probably because she feared losing her job, or she feared being silenced, or both. You could also argue that on paper, it's easy to ignore a lone voice crying out in the wilderness. It's easy to just let the entropy do its thing. It's harder when you gather 4 Olivias together and investigate for 4 years and then lay it on the table. And that's exactly where we are now. So what conspiracy are we dealing with here? A conspiracy to tell the truth, or a conspiracy of silence and denial? I don't think in a scenario where there isn't consent, one can say that the failure to speak up about it suddenly means it's consensual, or that this gives one a license to be licentious. The broader reality is a perpetrator that is a popular celebrity with money and social power versus someone else with far less agency, working in the same industry. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? Who's going to survive if an issue is made an issue in a situation like that? Who are the bosses going to give preferential treatment to? The glittering cash cow or the cowering, slobbering, salaried receptionist? Incidentally, the opposite of a conspiracy is the official story. Which is the official story in this case? Is it the most popular one? What's also interesting in terms of the timeline is that this incident occurred in June 2008, and Brand left the BBC a few months later in October, after Brand left obscene messages on a British actor's voicemail. And so where are we right now? Well, Russell Brand, with an easy sweep of his paw, claimed a few days ago that everything he did was consensual. Is that true officially? Or is the truth a harder, darker, less simple counter-narrative? The less simple counter-narrative that is slowly but inexorably slouching its way towards Bethlehem. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I want to just remind those who've been following my coverage of the John Benet Ramsey case, arguably the most famous unsolved American true crime case. I'll be doing the next 10 mistakes in CNN's special report, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.